I'm not ashamed to hold my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
We're on page 17 of our books this evening. We're hopefully in the last night of lesson 3, talking about how Bible words need to be defined by the context we read it. And basically what this lesson is teaching us is that different words have multiple meanings. And if we treat each word the same, no matter the context we read it in, we're going to run into Bible difficulties. We're going to run into problems not understanding or misunderstanding what's being talked about. And tonight's first word is an interesting one because there is some confusion, especially about Romans 16, as to what Phoebe was when it comes to the church. The word we're going to look at first is the word servant. And the author gives us 5. I don't care which order we go into. What is a servant? What could be defined like that? Let's not start with point E. If you want to go in a different order, that's fine. Let's not start with point E, though. What do we got?
Usually, a servant is someone that works for someone else.
Okay, so if they work for someone else, they could work in different ways. Like as far as the Bible talks about slaves. We don't think of slaves today. Bill had a picture in his Sunday class on respecting of persons, and it was illustrating about slavery and how the public really did treat each other with favoritism, and oftentimes, if you were not rich, you'd be a slave. But the word slave or servant itself, when it comes to meaning of slave, comes from the same Greek word, diakonos. And in John chapter 2, we have verses 5 and 6. So we go to John chapter 2, verses 5 and 6. Let's get Naomi to get this one.
His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons.
All right, so we find the word servant there. How can we understand that that's a slave? Maybe not a brutal slave like the sense of we think about it. But how can we understand that that use of the word servant is slave?
Well, we're told something that they must do.
Okay. And it goes to Tammy's use of the word. It is, they're workers. And in that context and time, if you were a servant, you were a slave. And so knowing a little bit about the time, knowing what these people's jobs was. These people were in charge of serving those who came to the wedding feast in Cana of Galilee in John chapter 2. And so in that context, we are talking about a physical slave, a physical servant. But that's not always what it means. Our next use of that word diakonos, or servant, is talking about Jesus himself. Let's come back to Romans 15, verse 8. And we'll get Tammy to get that.
Now I say that Jesus Christ has become a servant to the circumcision for the truth of God, who confirmed the promises made to the fathers.
Okay, diakonos is there for servant. Is Jesus a slave to the circumcision for the truth of God? In the same sense that it was used in John 2?
Not in the same sense.
No. How is it different?
Well, become a servant in a way that he's serving us. He has trying not to maybe just say he's paid the price for our sins, but Father gave him a job to do, which involved serving us.
Mhm. So Christ, in this context, Paul, remember, is saying, well, remember Romans 15 verse 4 says, what was written of old was written for our instruction. And we sometimes will run into that verse and will not read the rest of the context. Now I say that Jesus Christ has become a servant to the circumcision. Well, who are the circumcision?
Well, that's was Israel and us.
Yeah. Well, in this case, to the circumcision for the truth of God, to confirm the promises made to the fathers. So, Jesus, in what he did, yes, he died on the cross, but he died on the cross for the sins of mankind, the circumcision and the uncircumcision. But right now, he is performing a duty to confirm the promises made to the fathers by God. God made a promise to Abraham. Jesus proclaimed what that promise was and confirmed it through dying on the cross and being raised from the dead. It was prophesied in the Old Testament. We've been going through in our podcast, and we'll go through it again on Sunday. How come Paul became a Christian? Because he came to faith in Jesus as the Messiah. And how did he do that? He knew the law of Moses, and yes, he saw Jesus on the road to Damascus. Jesus was a servant to the Jews. He had a job to do. But he wasn't a slave in the sense of John 2. In other words, he didn't take the bidding of the Jews. He was a servant to them. But he didn't follow the orders of the Jews. He was following God's will, the Father's will. And so he wasn't serving the Father by doing God's will, in the sense of Romans 15. He was serving the Jews to confirm the Father's will. But just as Christ is a servant, we find that Christians can be servants too. Bill, you want to get Ephesians chapter 6, verse 21.
I was going to say, with that last thought, he showed that was part of his job as a servant.
Yeah.
Show us.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. To show us the way.
Ephesians 6:21.
Yeah.
So Ephesians 5. Now, so that you also may know about my circumstances, as to what I am doing, Tychicus, the beloved brother and faithful servant in the Lord, will make everything known to you.
Oh, I wish you took away my fun, Bill. But diakonos isn't that word, but in other versions it has ministered there, and I was going to ask he's using the New American Standard. Although he's actually, these verses must be the New King James, because ministers in his book, but of course the word is certain. Now, in minister, a lot of times people think of it as a title. It's not a title. What is the job of a minister? To serve. In a physical context, do we, like as far as the secular context, outside of a religious context, do we have ministers today? Think of Ontario, for instance, in Canada.
Prime Minister.
The Prime Minister. And we have the Minister of Health, the Minister of Education. So they are the servants, but also, like as far as they serve others. That's what it means to minister to others, is to serve the needs of others. And so, if he is a minister in the Lord, what does he do?
He does things that involve the Lord, involve that realm. if you
Yeah.
will.
So if he ministers in the Lord, could be preaching, could be helping the saints with some of the needs that they have. Could be edifying the saints. It's in the Lord. He is a minister. He is following the example of Jesus. Usually we think of ministers as ones who preach. And preaching is ministry. And that's why it's sometimes called the ministry. But being a minister isn't just preaching. There's more to being a minister in the Lord. It is being a Christian, serving others. And I don't know what's going on. Your phones might be going off. There's an Amber Alert. So if you have your sound on, please turn it off. But a minister is someone who ministers to others in whatever they need. And all Christians should be ministers in that sense. Then, of course, we have an actual servant of the church. Let's go to 1 Timothy 3. Henry, you want to get 1 Timothy 3, verse 8, and Naomi, Philippians chapter 1, verse 1.
Likewise, deacons must be reverent, not a dark word tongued, not giving too much wine, not greedy for money.
All right, Philippians 1, verse 1.
Paul and Timothy, servants of Christ Jesus, to all the saints in Christ Jesus who are at Philippi with the overseers and deacons.
Okay. Now, we talked about overseers last week. We're not going to talk about overseers. Why is this? Why can we know from the context of 1 Timothy 3 and Philippians 1 that deacon, which is diakonos, which is servant, is something different than Ephesians 6:21 and John 2:5 and 6? How can we know it's different?
God stipulated it.
Okay, God stipulated. How did he do that? Yes, he calls them deacons. He could have very easily called them servants, like he calls, in Naomi's version, elders, overseers. How do we know that this is something different than just a regular servant?
Well, in Ephesians 6 and 1, it just seems that Tychicus was a messenger.
Mm-hmm.
He was just bringing news.
Yeah.
That's not saying he didn't help Paul.
No. I understand what you mean.
But here, deacons, that's laying out certain restrictions.
Yeah. And qualifications.
Yeah.
So, in other words, when you read 1 Timothy 3, you're going to find that the servant has to be the husband of one wife again, has to have children who he is controlling, can't be double-tongued, given too much wine, greedy for money. Most of these things are examples of what a Christian is to be. But husband of one wife, are there Christian women? Yeah. So a Christian woman can't be a deacon in the context of 1 Timothy 3. Over in a moment, we're going to go to Romans 16, and we're going to find out that women can be servants. And sometimes that word deacon is used in regards to that. Deacon can be translated every time you see diakonos. Just like servant can be translated every time you see diakonos. It's not deacon is used here perhaps to denote from our translators that this is not just a servant in the sense of every Christian is a servant. There are servants to the church that take care of the things of the church. Elders oversee the congregation, but deacons are the ones who serve. So elders might ensure that the congregation is being properly fed, spiritual food. They might be helping to deal with some of the problems that might arise. They might teach themselves. Deacons are the ones who execute some of what the elders need done. I've been to many churches, and the elders are needing to ensure that, okay, maybe the kids they have to make sure that the kids are being brought up properly in Bible class, that they're being taught what they need to teach. But they might put a deacon in charge of making sure that the material is ordered, that the teachers have what they need to teach, that what we might call day-to-day affairs are met, that everything is executed properly, because the elders can't do everything. Elders who try to get their noses in everything are ones that are going to be overlooking problems that exist, because there's only so many hours of the day. There's only so many things you can do. And so deacons help the church not by serving the elders. They're serving the church. And this is more than just simply a servant in the church. Which brings us to Romans 16, verse 1. And we'll come back to Tammy.
I commend to you Phoebe, our sister, who is a servant of the church of Centuria.
Okay. Not a problem there. From that version, what are you reading from? New King James, that's what I thought. However, does your version, Naomi English Standard, do anything different? No. Does your version, the New American Standard, do anything different, Bill?
No, mine's servant.
Servant. Some versions will translate it as deaconess or deacon. Let me go see if it's the King James. I forgot to look that up.
No, that's servant too.
But there are some who come along and say, Phoebe was a deacon of the church. And she is a servant of the church. That's for sure. But how do we know she's not a deacon like we read in 1 Timothy 3? She doesn't meet the qualifications of of a deacon in the sense of that. But how was she a servant of the church? Let's go back to Romans 16 and figure out what her job was. Let's go to Romans 16 now. We'll get verse 2. Bill, you want to get verse 2?
Romans 16?
Yes.
That you receive her in the Lord in a manner worthy of the saints, and that you help her in whatever matter she may have need of you. For she herself has also been a helper of many, and of myself as well.
So how is she a servant of the church? She is helping others, and Paul also. Plus, I have a question. How did the Romans get the book of Romans, the letter to the Romans? Perhaps it was Phoebe who brought it to them. We're so used to dropping post in the mail, and the postwoman comes and delivers it. We're so used to doing that. And yet, that's not, someone had to deliver the mail. Someone had to deliver Paul's letter. Sometimes we read of Timothy being the one, or Titus being the one, or Silas being the one. Here, it's very quite possible. Since he says, I commend to you Phoebe, I mean, she's coming at least with the letter, if not delivering it herself, because she's coming to Rome to do business. And just as Phoebe helped others, these Christians in Rome were to help her. And so she is a servant, just like every Christian is a servant. She might be doing some things that men don't typically do. Doesn't mean that she's any less than. But there are, I know in this church, women who prepare the Lord's Supper for congregation every Sunday. Would we say that they're a servant? Yes. I know of women who type out the financial reports. They don't do them. They're not taking care of the church's finances, but they're typing them out. Is that a servant? I would come along and say, yeah, that's a servant. Some might send out cards and call people. Are they serving? Yes, they're serving. They don't have to have an official title or an official office to be a servant, and we can all be servants. But Phoebe doesn't fit the qualifications. She is not the husband of one wife. She's a woman. But women can be servants too. Let's not, as a church, think that God overlooked women or gave them a lesser role. Servants are exalted by Jesus, not diminished. Jesus in John 13 told the apostles that they needed to be servants, not lords. The Gentiles made themselves lords. The apostles were to be servants, and Christians are to be servants. That is a role that everyone can partake in, and a role that should be sought after and never looked down upon. Because if we don't have any servants, church isn't going to function the way it should. People are going to be forgotten, problems are going to be overlooked, and things are just not going to get done properly. We need servants. Any comments on servants?
Of course, you never know. In that day and age, there might have been tons of daily needs that people, people don't have clothing or food. That would be what the ladies would do.
I'm thinking of Tabitha in Acts 9.
Right.
That did those things. Tending to the women. As far as you think about it, there are women in the congregation that might need help. Well, who better to put in charge of or not in charge, but seeing that it's done than women? If there are certain things that men just cannot do for those who might be elderly and not have family to care for, women can do those things. Just as men can do things for men that women should not do. Whereas when we think of married women going among single men alone, or single men going among married women, or even single women, it is useful for women to serve women, men to serve men. It's not that they can't serve each other. There are some things that would be better for women to serve women and men to serve men. So let's remember that when it comes to servant, doesn't always mean the same thing in every context. So let's get question 9. I know we usually say these to the end. How is a Christian to be called a slave? How is it that a Christian can be called a slave? We're servants of Christ. That's how Christians can be called a slave. We're not physical slaves. Paul in Romans 6 says we are slaves. We're slaves of righteousness. We are servants of righteousness. We're in a precarious situation. We're not quite done. Let's see if we can get through the breaking of bread. We probably won't get through laying on of hands, but maybe I can extend the laying on of hands a little next week. That's always one that people like to discuss, the laying on of hands. And so let's get breaking of bread. There are 2 ways in the book of Acts. In fact, in the very same chapter, I believe that there is the breaking of bread used in 2 instances, but in Acts 20 it's the same way. Acts 20, the same way. Acts chapter 2, let's get verses 42 and 46. The author has separated these into 2 sections. I believe actually both of them belong in both sections, and we'll discuss why. We have 2 possibilities for the breaking of bread. We have a meal, where bread is broken. In other words, that is what is known as metonymy for having a meal. You can break bread with one another without actually that the breaking of bread is symbolic of we're sitting down and having a meal. Bread is often served, and was during this day and age, at a meal. And everyone would have some bread. It didn't mean they didn't have other things too. So we're talking about a common meal. However, just as it can involve a common meal, it can also be a spiritual meal that we call the Lord's Supper. And we're going to see how the context can tell us which one we're talking about. Who's next? I think Bill's next. You want to go next to 42 and 46?
They were continually devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching and to fellowship, and breaking of bread and to prayer. Day by day, continuing with one mind in the temple, and breaking bread from house to house, they were taking their meals together with gladness and sincerity of heart.
So that's the question. If we're wanting to know the difference between a common meal and what we might call the Lord's Supper, how will we go about doing that from the context? What should we be looking for?
Well, here in this passage, the whole context is it's about daily living, like they're selling their property, possessions.
Okay.
Believers are together, they had all things in common. And then when we get down to 46, verse 46, it says that day by day, continuing with one mind in the temple. But then the breaking bread there was from house to house.
Okay. So we should be looking for signs of worship and the assembly of the church versus the assembly not of the church. If I meet Bill and Tammy at their home, is the church assembled? Can the church be assembled if I come meet? Sure, it could be assembled. But is it necessarily? No. What constitutes an assembly of the church? The church desires to gather together. Doesn't have to be just to worship. The church can gather together if we need to, as far as withdraw from one another. It doesn't have to be done at a worship service or an assembly, that case. The church might need to get together to discuss an issue that's going on. It doesn't have to be in this building, and it doesn't have to be during our normal assembled worship times. The church can gather on other days of the week, and can gather in a place that's not normally the meeting place. But when Christians get together, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the assembly of the church, and we need to remember that. Bible study. When we meet on Sunday morning, and what we're meeting now, is the church assembled? Not in the same way that it is when we assemble for worship. On Wednesday night, it may look a little bit more usual, because we don't have separate classes. When we have separate classes, the church is not meeting. Christians are meeting to study the Bible. But the church always is assembled together. We see that in Scripture. When you come together, 1 Corinthians 5. When you gather together in one place, 1 Corinthians 11, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. Christians gather together for a purpose as the church. And so, I believe when we look at verse 42, what do we talk about? Apostles' doctrine. Religious or secular? Religious. Fellowship, we often think of fellowship, oh, that's eating together. Well, then Luke is being repetitive. If fellowship is eating together, because he just talked about the breaking of bread in the next verse. Now, fellowship is when we meet together and we're in agreement with one another. We are exhorting one another. We are lifting up one another. We are encouraging one another. We are in agreement. That's fellowship. Fellowship is never used in the sense of eating a common meal. We can be in fellowship with one another and eat a common meal, but it is not that. The breaking of bread and prayers, all of those things are spiritual. So why would you come away from verse 42 and thinking breaking of bread there is anything but the Lord's Supper? Everything has to do with spiritual doctrine, spiritual fellowship, spiritual prayers. Why would the breaking of bread be anything different? But then to Bill's point, come down to verse 46. They continued daily with one accord in the temple. Okay, that's assembly. But the breaking of bread there was from house to house. It was not done together. It can't possibly be. There were 3,000 of them. You can't possibly have 3,000 people in one house. You can have them in the temple. I'll put a picture up on Sunday of the temple, and you'll see just how big it is. Bill and Tammy are football fans. 30 NFL football fields, I'm just talking about the playing fields, can fit on the Temple Mount. 30 of 32. So you could play every NFL Sunday football game on the Temple Mount. You can just put them all the way around. You can play them all at once. Now you can't have the fans like every stadium does. It's not every stadium. It's the field itself. It's huge. You think of a football stadium. It's 100 yards in the actual playing field, 10 yards in each end zone. And I don't know how wide the football field is, but it's not small. It's I don't know how many yards wide, but it's 100 yards, 120 yards is, what is that, 360 feet? 3 feet to a yard, plus 20 more yards. Yeah, it's about that. Not 360, that's too much. 300 and something else. I can't do math right now. It's 804. And, but it's over 300 feet. You think about that. It's a lot of room on the Temple Mount. That's why 3,000 can meet there. Breaking of bread, though, common meals, house to house. And so, even in the same context, you can have the same thing. Now, I'm going to go to Acts 20, because we get the same thing that Luke does here in Acts 20, verse 7 and verse 11. So now on the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight. We're going to skip down. After Paul raised Eutychus from the dead, he said, now when he had come up, had broken bread and eaten, and took a long while, even till daybreak, he departed. And so here we have Paul. The disciples come together on the first day of the week to break bread. Well, if the disciples are all coming together, Paul's preaching here. This is spiritual. Lord's Supper. He preaches until midnight. So if we're in Troas, we're going to be counting days similar to the way the Romans counted days, similar to the way we count days. If we were a Jew, this would be Thursday night. It would have been Thursday night at 5 o'clock when the sun set. Is this Thursday night to us? No, it's Wednesday night. Because our nights start at midnight. So this is the next day Paul's eating. But I suggest here, how many people are eating in verse 11? How many people are eating? He. And who is he? Paul.
Yeah.
Paul is the he here. Paul's the one been speaking till midnight. I don't know how long Paul spoke, but Paul spoke for a while. Is the Lord's Supper eaten of by one person? No. No, it is not. I know here, what we have here, it is Luke is present. In verse 6, now we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread. Luke is here. In verse 7, the disciples gathered together to break bread. But in verse 11, he ate. 1 Corinthians 11 will teach us that the Lord's Supper is eaten up together. It's not a one-person sort of thing. Everyone partakes. And so, why would Paul eat in verse 11? Well, he's hungry. This shows us there's nothing wrong with eating in the place where Christians might worship. But that's not why they gathered together. They gathered together to partake of the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week. But this was where someone obviously had some food. It was dark. They had worked all day. So there was something for Paul to eat because Paul needed to be strengthened. And Paul had, of course, been traveling too and was about to travel. And so the we comes right up back in verse 13. Luke didn't eat. It says when he ate, not when we ate. I think that's important that we follow along because Luke uses pronouns very, very accurately. He, they, we. He's always very meticulous in how he uses pronouns. So the breaking of bread can be a common meal. It can be the Lord's Supper. And we can know the difference if we read the context.
I'm not